Welcome back to episode 3 of In the Archives, a history podcast, where each episode I break down and read a different primary source. As always, I'm your host, Katie Bell. Last week, we started the conversation about communication on the Titanic, and we discussed the testimony of Harold S. Bride. If you haven't listened to that podcast episode yet, I highly recommend you listen to that before you listen to this episode. So, last week I asked the question, was poor communication a factor in the sinking of the Titanic? I broke down the testimony of the only surviving wireless operator of the Titanic, Harold S. Bride. While the ship was sinking, Bride and his partner, John Phillips, the other wireless operator on board, sent out distress signals from 12:10 a.m. on April 15th, 1912, to just minutes before the Titanic sank underneath the ocean at around 2:20. Only a handful of these ships responded to the distress signals, and many of them were too far away for a quick and immediate rescue. The Carpathia was the closest ship to respond. They were only 58 miles away from the Titanic. Philip Bride and John Phillips, the wireless operators on the Titanic, believed that the ship, the Carpathia, was their best hope for rescue and survival. In his testimony, Philip Bride stated, "We knew that the Carpathia was the best thing doing. At this point, the crew and the passengers had to put their trust in the Carpathia. They had no other choice. Their backs were against the wall, and the ship was sinking fast. The only thing Bride and Phillips could do at this moment was to keep sending distress signals and updating the Carpathia of their condition. It was up to the Carpathia to respond quickly and save them." Which brings us to the topic of today's episode. What was communication like on the Carpathia? In this episode, this question will be answered as we dive into the testimony of Harold Cottman, the only wireless operator aboard the Carpathia. Before we dive into his testimony, let's review the key points of last week's episode, as we will need them to understand Cottman's testimony. I will also add some context for today's episode. First, let's talk about the people who are mentioned in today's episode. First, let's discuss the people involved in the incident. I understand that last episode had a lot of names, and I apologize if you were confused by the names and the who's who of it all. I will do better this episode, but luckily, there are less names in this episode. So let's break down the names, starting with the people aboard the Titanic. There's only two names that you really need to know for this episode. Those are John Phillips and Harold Bride. John Phillips was the senior wireless operator aboard the Titanic, and he was the one who sent the distress signals. He was also the main person who was in contact with the Carpathia during the sinking. He unfortunately died during the sinking of the ship, and his body was brought onto the Carpathia. The next person is Harold Bride. He was the junior wireless operator aboard the Titanic. He survived the sinking and made it onto the Carpathia. Moving ships, we come to the Carpathia. There are also two important names or people that we need to know. The first is Harold Cottman. We will be reading his testimony today. He was the only wireless operator aboard the Carpathia. The next is Captain Arthur Royston. He is the captain of the Carpathia. And then the final name that is good to keep in mind is Senator William Alden Smith. He is a U.S. Senator who proposed the Titanic disaster hearings. It is this hearing that we will be reading from today. He will be the one who will be asking the questions to the witnesses. Let's review the ships who answered the Titanic's distress call. The first ship to answer was the Frankfurt, but they failed to send their position, as the operator apparently did not grasp the danger the Titanic was in. Their position was never given, even though they called twice. The next ship is the Carpathia. This ship is part of the Cunard line of ships, and it responded to the distress call with coordinates, and the ship immediately changed its course and headed full steam towards the Titanic. They were 58 nautical miles away, and it would take them about 3 hours to reach the Titanic. The next ship to respond was the Olympic. They also responded and changed their course, but they were too far away to help the Titanic in any way. Other ships that responded were the Baltic, Mount Temple, Burma, and Virginian. All responded to the distress signal, but were too far away to offer any real assistance. The Carpathia was their only hope. Philip sent out the first distress signal at around 12:10 to 12:15. The first message was CQD-MYG. CQD is a distress signal. That means all stations stand by at attention, while MYG was the code for the Titanic. Philip also sent out an SOS, although the SOS signal was a newer one and not as widely known. The CQD was the most recognizable distress signal among the wireless operators. The code was mainly used by the operators of the Marconi telegraph system. This was installed on many ships, including the Titanic and the Carpathia. About 5 to 10 minutes after Philip sent out the first distress call, the Carpathia responds. This is around 12:20 to 12:25. Aboard the Carpathia, it was all hands on deck, as the Carpathia headed full steam towards the Titanic, while Captain Royston, the captain of the Carpathia, posted extra lookouts as the direction they were headed was a treacherous one and full of ice fields. Cottman sat at his wireless apparatus, constantly updating the Titanic of the Carpathia's location, while the operators of the Titanic updated Cottman on their worsening situation. At 2:17, Philip sent the last message to the Carpathia. The ship was still 40 miles away. At 3:30, the Carpathia finally arrived at the scene of the crash, an hour and a half after the Titanic sank. Harold Cottman's testimony is an interesting one. Testimony adds and shares some much-needed context on the situation. Bride could only tell his story based on what he observed and what Phillips told him. As Bride stated in his testimony, "You see, I could read what Mr. Phillips was sending, but I could not really get the answers because he had the telephones on." Bride was unaware of the other ship's response to the CQD. All he knew is what Phillips told him or what he read from the messages Philip was sending. On the other hand, Cottman was aboard the Carpathia, sat at his apparatus the entire time of the sinking and the journey to the Titanic. He was in constant communication with the Titanic. He would say who called and who didn't. Cottman's testimony fills in the gaps of Bride's testimony. So, without any further delay, let's dive into the testimony of the sole wireless operator aboard the Carpathia. Again, I will be reading from the Titanic Disaster Senate hearings, edited by Thomas Kuntz. Senator Smith will be the one asking the questions, while Cottman will answer them. Witness Harold Cottman, 21, wireless operator on the rescue ship, the Carpathia. Senator Smith: how did you happen to catch this communication from the Titanic? Mr. Cottman: I was looking up for the Parisian to confirm our previous communication with the Parisian. Senator Smith: you had been in communication with the Parisian that day? Cottman: yes, sir. Senator Smith: at what time? Cottman: I cannot say. At some time in the afternoon, sir. Senator Smith: not a distress signal? Cottman. Oh, no, sir. Smith. Some commercial or business communication. Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Did you hear the captain of the Carpathia today? Cottman. No, sir. Smith. He said you were about to retire. Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. And you caught this message rather providentially. Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. How far have you gotten in your arrangements to retire? Cottman. Well, I was about to retire. Smith. Had you taken off any of your clothing? Cottman. I had my coat off. Smith. When you took your coat off, did you have any instruments attached to your head? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. What? Cottman. Telephones. Smith. How did you happen to leave that on? Cottman. I was waiting for the Parisian. Smith. How long would you have waited? Just long enough to undress? Cottman. I would have waited a couple minutes. I had just called the Parisian and was waiting for a reply if there was one. Senator Smith. So you kept this telephone on your ears, on your head? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. With the hope that before you go into bed, you might have a message confirmed. Cottman. Yes. Smith. Was that what you had in mind? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. What did you hear at this time? Cottman. I heard nothing. Smith. How soon? You heard something pretty quick, did you not? Cottman. No, sir. I went back on to Cape Cod again. Smith. And you still left this apparatus on? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Did you send a message to Cape Cod? Cottman. No, sir. Smith. Did Cape Cod send a message to you? Cottman. No, sir. Smith. Then as a matter of fact, you did not get back to Cape Cod. Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. How? Cottman. They were sending it for the transatlantic two-man ship. They were sending the news to the senior ships. Smith. Where? Cottman. These ships that contribute to the Marconi press. Smith. You got into communication. Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Would one of the Marconi stations? Cottman. I did not establish it. I was receiving the press communications from Cape Cod. Smith. While you were undressing there? Cottman. I was not undressing. Smith. After you had taken off your coat? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. And did you sit down to your instrument? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. And you received this message? Cottman. I received about 4. Smith. In how many minutes? Cottman. About 7 or 8 minutes. Smith. You received 4 in 7 to 8 minutes. Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Did that include anything from the Parisian? Cottman. No, sir. Smith. Simply this Cape Cod relay service? Cottman. Yes, sir. Sending messages for the Titanic. I was taking the message down with the hope of retransmitting them the following morning. Smith. Let us understand that a little. When did you first know anything about the Titanic? Cottman. I had had communication with her late in the afternoon, 5:30 or 6. Smith. A stray communication or one addressed to the Carpathia? Cottman. One addressed to the Carpathia. Smith. What did it say? Cottman. It was a message for one of our passengers aboard. Smith. For whom? Cottman. Miss Marshall. Smith. A commercial message. An official message? Cottman. A commercial message. Smith. So that was the only message you received from the Titanic in the afternoon? Was the message answered? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Did you know anything about how far you were from her at the time? Cottman. No. Smith. Have you no means of knowing? Cottman. No, sir. Smith. After you got through with this regular business, then what did you do? Cottman. I called the Titanic. Smith. You called the Titanic yourself? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Who told you to do it? Cottman. I did it of my own free will. Smith. You did it of your own accord? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. What did you say? Cottman. I asked him if he was aware that Cape Cod was sending a batch of messages for him. Smith. And did he reply? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. What did they say? Cottman. Come at once. Smith. Did you gather from that they had received your communication? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. And this was the reply? Cottman. He said, "Come at once." It was a distress message. CQD. Smith. Only 3 words were used. Cottman. No, sir. All the lot. The whole message was for me. Senator Smith. When you received that message, what did you do? Cottman. I confirmed it by asking him if I was to report to the captain. Smith. Before you reported the captain, you asked him if you were to report to the captain. Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Did you get an answer? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. What did it say? Cottman. It said yes. Smith. How did you happen to confirm it? Cottman. By asking him if Smith. But what prompted you to confirm it before you delivered it to the captain? Cottman. Because it is always wise to confirm a message of that description. Smith. Do you always do it? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Are you instructed to do it? Cottman. No, sir. Smith. Or is it a matter of discretion? Cottman. It is a matter of discretion. Smith. Had you been misled by messages that were without foundation that prompted you to confirm that message? Cottman. No, sir. Smith. What would you have done if you had not received any confirmation? Cottman. I should have reported the communication. Smith. You would have reported it to the captain. Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. How much time elapsed between the time when you received that distress call and the time you communicated it to your captain? Cottman. A matter of couple minutes. Smith. Only a couple minutes? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Did you send any messages after that to the Titanic? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. For whom? Cottman. For the Titanic. Smith. At the instance of the captain? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. What message? Cottman. Opposition. Smith. What did you say? Cottman. I simply sent our position. Smith. Can you state it to the reporter? Cottman. I cannot remember what the position was now. Smith. You cannot remember it. Cottman. No, sir. Smith. But you gave the position of your ship, its longitude. Is that the idea? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. And you did that at the suggestion of your captain? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Did he write out a formal message for you? Cottman. No, sir. Smith. He told you? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. And you sent it? Cottman. Yes, sir. He wrote the position on a little slip of paper. Smith. And you sent that? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Did you get any reply to that? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. How long afterwards? Cottman. Immediately, sir. Smith. Signed by anyone? Cottman. No, sir. Smith. What did it say? Cottman. It simply gave me received. Smith. Is that all? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Signed by the operator or signed by anybody? Cottman. No, sir. Smith. When did you next hear from the Titanic or communicate with her? Cottman. About 4 minutes afterwards. Senator Smith. Did you communicate with her or she with you? Cottman. We communicated with each other. Smith. Who sent the first message? Cottman. I did. Smith. 4 minutes after this last message giving your position. Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. You sent another. Cottman. Yes. Smith. What did you say in that? Cottman. Confirmed both our positions, that of the Titanic and ours. Smith. Did you get anything from that? Cottman. No, sir. Only an acknowledgement. Smith. What did it say? Cottman. All right. Smith. When did you when did you when do you did you next communicate or receive a communication? Cottman. A few minutes afterwards. Smith. How many minutes? Cottman. I could not say, sir, because there was another ship calling the Titanic. Smith. How do you know? Cottman. Because I heard it. Smith. What did you hear? Cottman. I heard him calling the Titanic. Smith. I understand, but what was said? Cottman. There was nothing but the call, sir. Smith. A distress call? Cottman. No, sir. Smith. Do you know what boat it was? Cottman, the Frankfurt. Smith, the North German Lloyd boat. Cottman, I do not know whether it is the North German Lloyd. It is some German line. I do not know which one. Smith, you heard this call. Cottman, yes. Smith, the German boat was calling the Titanic. Cottman, yes, sir. Smith, and did that disarrange your signals? Cottman, no, sir. Smith, but after the call was finished, then what did you get, if anything? Cottman, I heard the Olympic calling the Titanic. Smith, did you hear the Titanic calling the Olympic? Cottman, no, sir, not at first. Smith, but you heard the Olympic calling the Titanic. Cottman, yes, sir. Smith, what did the Olympic say? Cottman, he was calling him to offer a service message. Smith, offering their service? Cottman, offering a service message. Smith, then what followed? Cottman, nothing for about half a minute. Everything was quiet. Smith, nothing for about half a minute. Cottman, yes. Smith, by this time you were quite alert to the situation, were you? Cottman, I was in communication with some station or other the whole way from the time of the wreck right to New York. Smith, you were in communication with some ship. Cottman, yes, sir. Smith, all the way? Yes, sir. Smith, and often? Cottman, yes, sir. Smith, after this minute, then what? Cottman, I asked the Titanic if he was aware that the Olympic was calling him, sir. Smith, what was the reply? Cottman, he said he was not. Smith, he was not aware of it? Cottman, no, sir. Smith, then what followed? Cottman, he told me that he could not read him because of the rush of air and the escape of steam. Smith, that he could not read him? Mr. Cottman, that he could not read him, yes, sir. Smith, could not read what? Cottman, the Olympic. Smith, that he could not read the message from the Olympic because of the rush of air. Cottman, yes, sir. Smith, and the escape of steam? Cottman, yes, sir. Smith, what was the next thing you heard? Cottman, then the Titanic called the Olympic. Smith, was there anything urgent about that, or anything related to the Titanic? Cottman, no, sir. Smith, what did you do then? Cottman, I told the Titanic to call the Baltic. Smith, what followed? Cottman, the communication was apparently unsatisfactory. Smith, it was apparently unsatisfactory? Cottman, yes. Smith, well, go right ahead. Now tell us just what occurred as long as you were on board the ship doing your work to the time of the rescue of these people. Cottman, I was in communication at regular intervals the whole of the time until the last communication I gained with the Titanic. Smith, you heard that? Cottman, yes, sir. Smith, what was said in that message? Cottman, he told me to come at once, that he was head down, and he sent his position. Smith, and do you know whether he got any reply to that message? Cottman, yes, sir. Smith, what was it? Cottman, received. He told him the message was received. Smith, is that all? Cottman, yes, sir. Smith, when did you hear anything again? What happened next? Cottman, I heard the Baltic calling Cape Race, Newfoundland. Smith, you were in regular communication? Smith, yes. Smith, with the Titanic? Cottman, yes, sir. Smith, until the last communication was heard. Cottman, yes, until the last communication was heard. Smith, what was the last one? Cottman, the last one was come quick. Our engine room is filling up to the boilers. Smith, that was the last communication you received? Cottman, yes, sir. Smith, I thought I understood the captain to say that one of the last messages told the sinking ship that they were within a certain distance and coming hard or coming fast. Cottman, I called him with that message, but I got no acknowledgement. Smith, just tell us what that message was. Cottman, the captain told me to tell the Titanic that all our boats were ready and we were coming as hard as we could. would double a watch on the engine room and to be prepared when we got there with lifeboats. I got no acknowledgement of that message. Smith. But you sent it. Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Whether it was received or not, you don't know. Cottman. No, sir. Smith. Let us understand. When you received that last call from the Titanic, that our engine room was filling with water, you say you acknowledged its receipt and took that message to the captain. Did you acknowledge the receipt before you took it to the captain? Cottman. Yes, sir. Smith. Then after you had taken this message to the captain, you came back to your instrument and sent the message that you had just described. Cottman. Yes, sir. And you received no reply or any other word from the ship. Cottman. No, sir. That is where Kuntz leaves off in the testimony of Harold Bride. The testimony is much shorter than Bride's, but gives so many details about the crash and the communication between the ships. There is so much to dissect and discuss, but the main points and takeaways that I would like to break down are the chances that Cottman heard the distress signal. Why did Cottman ask if he should report the message to his captain after he received the distress call? The response of the Carpathia and the Frankfurt to the distress call, and the last messages sent. But first, let me form a timeline of events from the testimony of Harold Cottman. April 14th, 1912, 5:30 or 6 p.m. The Titanic sends a message to the Carpathia. This message was just a passenger message. The Carpathia nor the Titanic sent each other ice warnings in the days leading up to the crash. Late in the night, probably minutes before or around the time of the Titanic's crash, Cottman takes off his coat and is about to retire, but he is waiting on a response from the Parisian. He has his apparatus on at the moment. While waiting, he contacts Cape Cod. He receives 4 messages within 7 to 8 minutes from Cape Cod. He intends on passing them along to the Titanic in the morning. He contacts the Titanic to ask them if they were aware that Cape Cod was trying to communicate with them. The Titanic sends their distress call, "Come at once," immediately. Cottman responds, "Should I notify the captain?" The Titanic responds with yes. Cottman reports to his captain, Captain Royston, about the situation. Captain Royston hands Cottman their position and immediately turns the ship around and heads towards the Titanic. Cottman replies to the Titanic with the Carpathia's coordinates and assures that they are on their way. The duration of time between the distress call, reporting to the captain, and Cottman's response was only a couple of minutes. The Titanic sent an immediate reply of received. 4 minutes later, Cottman sends another message to the Titanic confirming their positions of both the Carpathia and the Titanic. A few minutes later, Cottman calls the Titanic again, but this time the Titanic is communicating with the Frankfurt. Call with the Frankfurt and the Titanic ends, and the Olympic calls the Titanic. The Olympic message is a service message. 30 seconds of silence as the Titanic is unaware that the Olympic is calling. Cottman notifies the Titanic of the Olympic's call. The Titanic responds to Cottman's message with, though they were not aware that the Olympics call. The Titanic cannot read the Olympic because of a rush of air and steam. This was the communication that the Titanic gave to the Carpathia. The Titanic and the Olympic talk. Cottman tells the Titanic to call the Baltic. The communication between the Titanic and the Baltic was unsatisfactory. Cottman is in constant communication with the Titanic in regular intervals until the last message. Cottman replies to the last message with received and shares a message with Captain Royston. Cottman does not hear back from the Titanic after this message. This is Cottman's order of events based off his testimony. This timeline gives us a clearer picture into what Cottman was doing at and up to the time he received the first distress call from the Titanic. One surprising detail that is pointed out by the timeline and testimony is Cottman never heard the first distress signal that the Titanic sent out at around 12:15. Instead, Cottman makes an effort on his part to begin communication with the Titanic around 12:25, 10 minutes after the distress signal. Cottman and the Carpathia's response to the crash was a pure stroke of luck, or as Captain Royston describes it, providential. It was by luck that Harold Cottman, the wireless operator of the Carpathia, received the distress signal. By the time the distress signal came through, Cottman was about to retire for the night, but was up because he was waiting to hear back from the Parisian. Cottman missed the initial distress call from the Titanic, and he originally contacted the ship to inform the operators about the traffic from Cape Cod. Cottman was met with the distress signal, and within 5 minutes, the Carpathia was heading full speed towards the Titanic. This stroke of luck was called providential by Carpathia's captain, and in a way it was. If Cottman was not waiting to hear back from the Parisian that night, it would have he would have shut off his machine and gone to bed. Cottman would have never heard the distress call, and the Carpathia, who was the closest ship, would have never been there to rescue the Titanic or its survivors. It was also lucky that Cape Cod happened to be transmitting at that time. It was the Cape Cod transmission that prompted Cottman to call the Titanic. But what exactly is Cape Cod? If you ever looked deeply or studied anything about the Titanic, you might come across Cape Cod or Cape Race. In his testimony, Cottman testifies that he was in communications with Cape Cod at the time, or rather, a ship that transmitted the Cape Cod communication to senior ships. Cape Cod and Cape Race were wireless stations built by the Marconi Company to supply transmissions and news from the mainland to ships in the ocean. Smaller ships were used to broaden the range of the land stations so ships out of range could receive these messages. These ships served as intermediaries between the land stations and the senior ships. As Cottman states in his testimony, they were sending it from the transatlantic two-man ships. They were sending the news to the senior ships. Cottman received the Cape Cod news from these smaller ships. There were two stations along the coast of the Atlantic. One was in North America at Cape Cod, and the other was in Newfoundland, known as Cape Race. That night, the Cape Cod station was called Cottman with news. The night of April 14th, 1912, Cottman took 4 messages that came from the Cape Cod station. These were general messages meant for any and all ships. However, the timing of the messages may have coincided with the first distress call from the Titanic, which is why Cottman was unaware of the Titanic's predicament when he called to tell him about Cape Cod. Cottman only called the Titanic to inform the ship's wireless operator that Cape Cod was trying to reach them. He was met with the distress signal. Upon receiving the distress signal, Cottman immediately responded with, "Should I report to my captain?" The Titanic responds with yes, and Cottman reports to Captain Royston, relaying the distress call and the Titanic's coordinates to him. If you remember from last episode, Senator Smith drilled Bride and Marconi about the CQD, the distress call, and whether that it was the best call to be used if the people understood it. Cottman's testimony takes place before Bride's does, so Senator Smith has no idea about the distress call or what it means. All he knows is that there was a distress call sent out. Smith's scrutiny is part of the discovery process. He wants to know the reason why Cottman took the actions he did, and whether he understood what the distress call meant. In the testimony, Senator Smith Asks, when you received that message, what did you do? Cottman, I confirmed it by asking him if I was to report to my captain. Smith, how did you happen to confirm it? Cottman, by asking him if. Smith, I know, but what prompted you to confirm it before you delivered it to the captain? Cottman, because it is always wise to confirm a message of that description. Smith wanted to know the reason behind confirming a distress call. After all, it's a distress call. So, what is the point of asking what appears to be a frivolous and obvious question, such as, should I report to my captain? For Cottman, he has his own set of rules that he places on himself. His philosophy is to double check with the Titanic operator to make sure he did not misunderstand the initial distress message. Either way, Cottman knew that the CQD meant he would report to his captain. Cottman responds with, it is always wise to confirm a message of that description. Although confirmation such as what Cottman did was not necessary or required for telegraph operators to do, he did it anyways. And it is understandable to be confused by this action. For us and Senator Smith, outsiders looking in on the situation, and people who know the full circumstances that the Titanic was under, it is easy for us to assume that a person in Cottman's situation would waste no time in reporting the distress call to his captain. Yet, he sent a confirmation message. It is important to note that Cottman started communication with the Titanic, not the other way around. He was met with a message that he did not expect to get. So it seems sensible that Cottman would double check to make sure he knew for sure the Titanic was in distress. Cottman knew 100% that, that the distress signal was, but he took it a step further by asking if he should talk to his captain. This question gives him extra assurance on the matter. His inquiry only took about a couple seconds. Reading Cottman's testimony, one can clearly see a difference on how the ships responded. Last week, Smith and Bride focused mainly on the Frankfurt's response and whether the operator understood the CQD or not. Cottman's testimony showed a rapid response from the Carpathia. The following is a timeline of the Carpathia and the Frankfurt's calls to the Titanic after the initial distress call. The Frankfurt was the first ship responded to the distress call. The Frankfurt answered the call by telling the Titanic operators to stand by. At this point, the Frankfurt failed to give her location. 2 minutes later, the Carpathia calls. Phillips sends the CQD to them. Cottman responds with, should I tell my captain? Philip responds, yes. Cottman informs his captain, Captain Royston, of Titanic's predicament. A couple minutes later, Cottman calls the Titanic again with their location and to inform the Titanic that they have changed their course and were heading full steam towards them. 4 minutes later, the Carpathia and the Titanic are in communications to confirm their position. Titanic acknowledges Carpathia's calls. Around 12:34, the Frankfurt calls again, 20 minutes after their first call. The Frankfurt asks, "What's the matter?" Philip, annoyed, dismissed the operator of the Frankfurt by calling him a fool. No further communication between the Frankfurt and the Titanic happened after this. During this call with the Frankfurt, Cottman tries to call the Titanic. From this point on, Cottman is in constant communication with the Titanic until Phillips sent out the last message at 2:17. The difference between the two wireless operators at the Frankfurt and the Carpathia is made clear through this. The Frankfurt's operator responds the CQD would stand by. This response put Phillips and Bride under the impression that he was getting the coordinates from his captain. But it was obvious that he did not get any coordinates, and when he called 20 minutes later with "What's the matter?" it was clear to Bride and Phillips that he was not worth the effort, and all communication ended. In those 20 minutes, the Frankfurt's operator failed to send coordinates or tell his captain about the distress call. On the other hand, aboard the Carpathia, Cottman misses the initial CQD but communicates with the Titanic to tell them about Cape Cod. Cottman hears back the distress call. It is clear that he knows what it means, but he asks the question, should I tell my captain? To double check. Once his message is confirmed, Cottman quickly tells his captain about the call. The Captain Royston takes immediate action as he changes the course and heads full speed towards the Titanic. Cottman delivers the Carpathia's coordinates to the Titanic and assures them that they are on their way at full speed. This whole interaction took place within a few minutes, like 3 or 4, not 20. From then until the ship sinking, Cottman is in constant communication with the Titanic, updating her on their location and confirming coordinates. One thing that I will point out, if you remember from last week's testimony, Senator Smith asked Bride why Phillips or him did not respond to the Frankfurt's question, "What's the matter?" with, "We are sinking and our lives and of our passengers and crew are in danger." Bride's response was CQD should have been enough for him, and claimed the operator aboard the Frankfurt did not know his business. The question posed by the Frankfurt, "What's the matter?" could be seen as just as frivolous as Cottman's question, "Should I get my captain?" After all, the CQD is everything in a nutshell, yet Cottman's question is not seen as ignorant. And this has everything to do with timing and the response. The Frankfurt was the first ship to respond, and they responded with "stand by," which Phillips and Bride took as he was getting his coordinates from his captain. And 20 minutes later, the Frankfurt responds with the frivolous question of "What's the matter?" A question Bride believed is answered within the distress signal itself. It is also important to note that when the Frankfurt called the second time, Cottman was also trying to call the Titanic. At this point in time, the Carpathia and the Titanic were in constant communication with each other. Phillips was probably aware of this, and his reasons for being frustrated and calling the Frankfurt operator fool is understandable in these circumstances, although this is just speculation. As for Cottman's initial question of "Should I get my captain?", which can also be seen as an unnecessary question, it was asked early enough and allowed for a short answer that Phillips could send quickly. That the question really didn't bother Phillips. From this point on, Cottman is in constant communication with the Titanic, rather than sporadic communication like the Frankfurt. Cottman, along with the crew of the Carpathia, took immediate action, while the Frankfurt's wireless operator did not. The final message the Titanic sent out was at 2:17. This would be the last time Cottman heard from the Titanic. The last message Cottman received from the Titanic read, "Come quick, our engine room is filling up to the boilers." After receiving this message, Cottman got up from his station to inform Captain Royston. Captain Royston gave Cottman their updated position and message. Cottman returned to his apparatus and sent the Titanic this. In his testimony, Cottman states, "The captain told me to tell the Titanic that all our boats were ready and we were coming as hard as we could, with a double watch on the engine room, and to be prepared when we got there, with lifeboats." Cottman did not receive a reply from the Titanic, as the ship had already sunk by the time the message was sent. At 3:30, the Carpathia arrives at the crash site. At 4 a.m., the Captain Royston stops the engines. By 8:30, all survivors are on board the Carpathia, and the Californian, another ship, shows up at the scene. The Carpathia sets sail for New York and arrives at the city on April 18th, 1912. The story of the Titanic did not end with the survivors boarded the Carpathia, but it continued as poor communication about the accident became a focal point in the news and in its investigation. Rumors and misinformation about the ship sinking controlled the narrative until the Carpathia docked in New York, and the Senate investigations began. Upon arriving in New York, Harold Bride said to a reporter in the first place, "The public should not blame anybody because more wireless messages about the disaster of the Titanic did not reach the shore from the Carpathia. I positively refused to send message and press dispatches because of the bulk of personal messages with touching words of grief was so large." Bride claims that he and Cottman had their hands full dealing with the passenger messages. Even when the Carpathia docked, Bride and Cottman, still on the ship, sent passenger messages. Cottman stated that he sent a list of names containing surviving passengers to crew of the Olympic and the Minnewaska. The operators sent a passenger list to other ships, but people wanted to know what happened. Cottman and Bride also claimed that it was the practice of the Marconi Company to not act as reporters and send messages ashore via other ships. In addition to this, Cottman and Bride claimed that they were simply following Captain Royston's orders to focus on official traffic and survivors' messages. However, the story of the Titanic sinking would soon come to light. For many interviews and official government hearings, all aspects of the crash and response were scrutinized. During the U.S. Senate hearing on the matter, the wireless operators aboard the Titanic and the Carpathia were heavily scrutinized for their actions, yet their stories seem to have been tossed to the side as our present day attention on the topic is captivated elsewhere. One takeaway from the testimony of Harold Bride is he was not negligent in his duty. He was he responded with great speed and readiness and stayed at his apparatus until the ship docked in New York. So was poor communication a factor in the sinking of the Titanic? Well, the answer isn't as clear as a yes or no. You can look at the ice warnings and the failure to plot those warnings that were sent the day the Titanic crashed and be like, yeah, of course they were. But when one considers the other details of the case, such as the conditions and regulations that the Marconi wireless operators were under, along with the actions of Phillips and Bride during the crash, it is hard to say yes so clearly. And I think that's the core of history. History has no yes or no answers. Instead, the answer is more complex. It is a series of events and circumstances that leads to a situation, such as the Titanic. It wasn't just on the wireless operators to report the ice warnings, it was also on the officers, it was also on the captain. There were many roles to be played, and the wireless operators only had a small one. Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, don't forget to leave a rating and review. And don't forget to follow us and turn on notifications so you know when the next episode is out. We post a new episode every 2 weeks, so catch us on August 28th for our next episode. In the meantime, you can follow us on X/Twitter at _in the archives for more. Till next time.